By the time the owner's influencer son fired me over Zoom, I'd already spent 22 years keeping his father's company from choking on its own code. 22 years of sticky carpets, buzzing fluorescent tubes, and a server room that smelled like ozone, roasted dust, and the slow decay of bad decisions. The place was called Brightline Retail Solutions, which sounded like something dreamed up by a branding agency after too much cold brew. In reality, it was a mid-market retail ERP vendor in a strip of mid-rise glass in Dallas, selling inventory, POS, and loyalty systems to mall chains that were one bad quarter away from becoming thrift stores. I was hired back when their cloud was a rack of beige towers in a closet and we thought RAID was magic. Now everything had a glossy web front end and a sales deck that said SaaS, but behind the login screen it was the same stitched-together monstrosity I'd been feeding and watering since my 20s. The main office smelled like burned coffee and carpet shampoo that never quite worked. At 7:30 every morning I'd swipe in, ride the elevator with the same half-asleep salespeople, and walk past the same Keurig machine making the same sludge. The coffee tasted like battery acid and mud had a bitter child. First sip, it scraped the back of your throat, left a metallic film on your tongue, and sat in your stomach like warm pennies. People still lined up for it like it was medicine. Maybe it was, we were all treating the same disease. The server room was in the middle of the floor with no windows, a glass door you had to badge twice to open, and just enough space to squeeze between racks without brushing them. The air in there was cold and dry and tasted faintly of metal. You could smell the power, ozone, hot plastic, and the ghost of burned-out PSUs. You stayed in there long enough, you started to smell like it too. My badge said Senior Systems Architect/License Administrator, but what it meant in practice was that every time something mission-critical needed patching, renewing, or resurrecting, they called me. When customers signed multi-million-dollar contracts for our omnichannel retail platform, what they were really signing was a promise that I'd keep the thing from going sideways on Black Friday. I'd done it long enough that my bones knew when a database was about to tip over before the monitoring did. The influencer son's name was Tyler, but his LinkedIn said Ty Hales, Digital Strategy and Community. He was 31, had 100,000 followers on some video platform I didn't have an account on, and wore sneakers that cost half my car payment. His father, Harold, owned 58% of Brightline's stock and 40 years' worth of retailer Rolodex. When Harold's cardiologist told him to stop working 15-hour days, he didn't sell. He parachuted his son into the business instead. They gave Ty the title Director of Brand and Innovation, a corner office he didn't need, and a mandate to modernize optics. He came to work in tailored joggers, white sneakers, a designer hoodie, and those tiny metal bracelets that look like handcuffs for rich people who call jail aesthetic. I told him that smell was 20,000 amps of power and every customer's sales history from the last decade. He laughed, said something about "we've really got to get you guys to the cloud," and left before the ozone got into his hair. He was always saying that, the cloud, like it was a spa, not someone else's server room that also smelled like hot silicon and despair. He liked buzzwords, they came out of his mouth in clusters. We need to pivot to a community-led growth motion. We have to show velocity to the street. We need synergy between our brand narrative and product roadmap. In meetings, he'd sprinkle optics over everything like salt. If finance said churn was up, he'd say the optics were bad. If support said tickets were piling, he'd say the optics needed managing. He ran one slide in every exec meeting that just said vibe in big letters. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a joke. It was. The thing he never bothered to learn, because nobody made him, was what actually made the company worth anything. It wasn't the app UI, which looked like someone had skinned a spreadsheet with Bootstrap. It wasn't the brand narrative, which changed every 6 months when marketing got bored. It was the contracts. In the early days, Brightline wasn't a vendor so much as a glorified dev shop. We built custom ERP modules for retailers who couldn't afford SAP but wanted something that looked bespoke. To protect ourselves from getting ground into dust by endless tweaks, our then lawyer wrote the contracts so that Brightline licensed its platform to customers, But all custom code and configuration logic written specifically for a client remained the intellectual property of the author until full payment and a maintenance commitment kicked in. At the time, author meant the little consultancy Herald ran out of a strip mall. Then Brightline became a corporation and that consultancy collapsed into the dev team. For convenience, and because legal didn't want to rewrite every master services agreement, we left the language alone. Custom code remains the property of the author until payment and maintenance obligations are fully satisfied. On 1,000 pages of work orders and change requests, my name sat next to developer of record and license administrator. I'd spent 2 decades touching almost every module we shipped. When we moved to a subscription model, legal bolted on new language, but they never scrubbed the old. The effect was that the core platform belonged to Brightline, but thousands of custom integrations, reporting engines, and data transformation routines that made the thing actually usable for our biggest customers were still licensed from me personally, or rather from D. Calder, per the old templates. Nobody cared as long as maintenance renewals were automatic and my W-2 said I worked there. Lawyers care about change. While you're quiet, they sleep. What turned that legal technicality into a kill switch was a product of the pandemic. When everything went remote and our biggest customer, a Midwestern department store chain called Marlowe's, panicked about their in-store systems, they made us sign a root license agreement. They wanted full continuity. If Brightline or any successor entity missed maintenance SLAs for more than 30 days, they could invoke a clause that said all custom IP Brightline had built for them, owned by any employee or contractor, would transfer to their control if and only if all outstanding compensation to that employee or contractor was paid in full. It was their safety net. If Brightline imploded and stopped paying people, the devs could be paid directly and the code would flow to Marlowe's. Our GC at the time balked. Herald saw $8 million a year in recurring revenue and told us to find a way. We did. I signed as author and license administrator. We filed it away. The only person who understood all the implications was me, and that was because I'd spent too many nights reading contracts while waiting for Oracle to finish patching. Ty didn't know any of this. The first time he stepped into a renewal call with Marlowe's, he thought he was coming in to talk about enhancing the loyalty program vibe. He never read the root license. Why would he? It didn't mention followers or engagement. He started gunning for me in month 3. At first it was subtle. He'd ask for things in Slack, can we just flip on Apple Pay for everyone? And I'd reply with links to PCI scope documents and a polite explanation of why just flipping it on wasn't a thing when your customers were one point of sale glitch away from a class action. He responded with emojis, eye rolls, rocket ships. He floated the idea of outsourcing the heavy lifting to some offshore shop he'd worked with on an app for a smoothie brand. I sent him a 1-page risk brief, customer data residency, export controls on encryption, GDPR exposure. He didn't comment. A week later, he forwarded my brief to marketing with the note, legacy brain says no again. But then he let Ty build a transformation council, and suddenly decisions that used to be made in a conference room with whiteboards and cost-benefit analysis were being made in a Slack channel called Moonshot. They wanted to sunset bloated service operations and move to a modern, plug-in ecosystem. Guess which group got tagged as the bloat? The invitation to the Zoom firing came at 8:45 on a Monday morning. Subject line, quick sync, role alignment. You learn to recognize certain phrases as weather alerts. Role alignment means someone's already made a decision and HR wants you on mute while they read it. I brewed the office coffee on autopilot. Old habits die hard, even though I was at my kitchen table, not the beige break room. Same cheap grounds, same metal carafe. First sip hit like an old mistake. It was bitter and thin and tasted like the sludge in the bottom of an uncleaned pot. If you bottled all the resentment in that building and ran hot water through it, you'd get that coffee. I logged into Zoom 5 minutes early out of muscle memory. They were late, of course. When they finally joined, it was Tyler, framed in soft natural light with a bookshelf behind him full of books that had never been opened. He wore a white tee under a tailored navy jacket and a gold chain. AirPods in, a little microphone hovering near his jaw like a chrome parasite. Next to him in a tiny square was HR doing that gentle half-smile people practice in the mirror so they can fire you without crying. Harold was nowhere to be seen. Ty didn't waste any time. He launched into a speech about where the company is going. He said we were no longer a product but a platform and community. He said we needed to rethink roles that were architected for a different era. Every few sentences he dropped in a buzzword like punctuation. Velocity, optics, agility. When he finally said my name, he called me a pillar of our legacy success and then followed it up with, but the skill sets we need now are different. He said I was too deep in the weeds. He said I did see the brand. Then he said the line that would come back to haunt him. He said, honestly, Danielle, you're kind of obsolete in this new motion. I thought about the root license in the Marlowe's contract with my name on it, about the clause that said IP stayed with the author until compensation was paid, about the addendum that said if the author was terminated and compensation lapsed, ownership shifted to the client, not the company. I thought about how many other contracts had my signature on the IP line, hundreds, maybe more. HR went through the paperwork, severance was 8 weeks, health coverage through the quarter, NDA with teeth. I listened without really hearing. When they asked if I had any questions, I asked one, is this effective immediately? Yes, HR said, immediately they'd be disabling my accounts at noon. Equipment courier scheduled for tomorrow. They expected me to turn in all company property. I said I understood. My mouth tasted like coffee and copper. They ended the call with some version of thank you for everything you've done. The Zoom squares blinked out. The little red dot in the corner disappeared. I stared at my own reflection for a second, 44 lines at the corners of my eyes from both laughter and squinting at logs, hair pulled back into a low knot, an old Brightline hoodie with a coffee stain on the sleeve. Obsolete. I almost laughed. I didn't touch their systems again. I closed the VPN window like it was a coffin lid. Then I went to my file cabinet and pulled out my red folder. Everyone at Brightline joked about it, the red folder that only came out when something had gone truly sideways. Inside were copies of key contracts, the original platform license, the weirder ones with side letters, and the Marlowe's root license. I'd kept my own copies because legal had a habit of losing anything that made life complicated. I read the Marlowe's document again, slowly. The language was as ugly as I remembered, but the skeleton was simple. Custom IP remained mine until all compensation was paid and maintenance met. In the event of termination, if Brightline stopped paying me and thus could no longer claim full rights, Marlowe could pay me directly to assume control. They insisted on adding a line, any attempt by Brightline to reassign or replicate this IP without the author's consent in such scenario will be considered a material breach, voiding this agreement. Dark contracts mean refunds, penalties, lawyers, maybe a class action if someone was feeling ambitious. I sipped cold coffee and let that settle. They cut my access at 11:52 a.m. in classic overcorrection fashion. 1 minute I could hit Jira, the next my credentials were invalid. I got the auto notification from Okta on my personal phone because they'd never turned off alerts. Breakups are sloppy. I watched the red dots pop up like measles. Email gone, VPN gone, license admin portal locked. The first sign that they'd forgotten the root license came not from them but from Marlowe's. I'd given my personal number to their CIO years ago after pulling an all-nighter to fix a corrupted ledger before their year-end close. He knew which side of the machine I stood on. At 4:07 p.m. he texted me 3 words. Are you okay? I replied with a question mark. He sent back a screenshot of an email from Brightline's customer success team informing Marlowe that due to internal restructuring, your primary systems architect is no longer with the company. There will be no impact to service. Underneath it, he'd forwarded a system alert. License check failed for module MARLOWE root, grace period 24 hours. Somewhere a cron job had reached out to confirm that D. Calder was still authorized against Brightline's internal license authority. It got a 403. The system did what it was told to do, started the grace clock, 24 hours of normal operations, then modules would start refusing to run. I called the CIO. I wasn't technically supposed to, but contract law is a funny thing when someone's ripped the floorboards up. We spoke like people who'd been through trenches together. He was furious, not at me, at them. He had 700 stores running Brightline. POS, inventory, loyalty, payroll feeds, all of it layered with custom code I'd built. They think they can just slide someone else in here, he said, breathing hard. They didn't even call before sending that email. I told him to read Section 14.3, Ownership of Custom Intellectual Property in Event of Author Termination. He went silent for a minute. When he came back, his voice was lower. They didn't pay out your contract yet, did they? He asked. Severance, I said, hadn't hit my account. Legally, I was terminated, not retained. Compensation for future work was zero. The IP on paper had snapped back to me like a rubber band. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted him not to burn while proving a point. I'd seen outages gut companies that weren't stupid enough to deserve it. Customers never see the contracts. They just see lines and shelves and paychecks. I said if Brightline didn't fix this proactively, he had grounds not only to walk away but to void the whole agreement as materially breached. He asked if I'd be willing to put that in writing for his legal team. I said I would for a fee. We ended the call with an understanding. I emailed his general counsel a letter summarizing the contract language, the effect of my termination on IP ownership, and the license check warning. I CC'd no one from Brightline. I wasn't their lawyer anymore. I wasn't their anything. The next day the machines did what they always do, followed instructions, oblivious to human politics. At 4:09 p.m. the grace period ended. At Store 1, the custom tax calculation module refused to load. The POS fell back to a generic engine meant for national chains. Marlowe's operated in 4 states with different clothing tax rules and city-level surtaxes. Receipts started printing the wrong rates. At Store 14, the nightly inventory sync script for the shoe department failed, its license check bouncing like a bad check. The control center dashboard started flashing red. Sync failed. In the central office, a finance analyst refreshed a reconciliation sheet and watched a column of numbers turn from black to red. They just overcollected tax in some places, undercollected in others, and mispriced half their sale items. Within an hour, customers were in line complaining. Word spread. Local news loved stories about bad receipts. On Brightline's side, the alerts multiplied, licensing errors cascaded. The root module took down dependent customizations one by one. Their status board went from green to yellow to red. At 5:30, someone finally remembered my name for more than a Slack joke. They tried my work email, bounced. They tried my company phone, disconnected. Then my personal phone lit up with a number I knew too well, Harold's. I answered on the 3rd ring, habit. His voice sounded older than it had a week ago, rougher, like he'd swallowed glass. He asked if we could talk. I said we were talking. He asked carefully if I'd been in touch with Marlowe's. I told him I'd answered a call. He said things were a little complicated with their licenses. I said they weren't complicated at all. The contract said what it said. He cursed under his breath, a very old man sound. Then he did the thing I'd been waiting for. He asked if I'd consider coming back just to help us through this bump. The idea of voluntarily stepping back into fluorescent purgatory made my teeth itch. But anger is a bad business manager. Revenge, done right, bills by the hour. I told him I'd help as an external consultant. I told him my rate, $10,000 an hour, 4-hour minimum per day, $200,000 retainer up front, wired before I logged into anything. I told him I wanted written acknowledgement from Brightline's counsel that my earlier warnings about license risk had been documented. I wanted my NDA narrowed, no gag on discussing my tenure in generic terms. Oh, and if he ever let his son call me obsolete again, I'd invoice an additional stupidity surcharge. He didn't even haggle. Desperation smooths negotiating edges. Within an hour, there was a DocuSign in my inbox with all the right signatures and a wire confirmation for the retainer. The contract made me an external strategic systems advisor. I laughed when I read the title. Fancy way to say the only person who knows where the breaker panel is. His background wasn't the artfully curated bookshelf anymore. It was a conference room with cords everywhere and a half-eaten takeout spread shoved to one side. For once, he didn't lead. I asked for share screen, they gave it. I walked through the license error logs like I'd never left. The smell in my apartment was citrus cleaner and last night's dinner, but my brain conjured the server room scent, dry, cold, hot dust, that ozone tang behind your teeth. The logs showed exactly what I expected. The root license authority had flipped to invalid, cascading failure to every dependent module. The system was doing what it was built to do, protect IP when authorization changed. It wasn't broken, it was loyal. We had 3 problems. Marlowe's systems needed to stop bleeding, Brightline had to be in enough compliance to keep auditors from having a field day, and the lawyers had to hammer out who owned what now. The last wasn't my job, not for free. The first 2 were. I had them provision a clean admin box and read me back the hash of the root certificate before I touched anything. Old habits. Then I used my local copies of license keys, the ones my past self had kept just in case, to generate temporary overrides bound to new entities Marlowe's legal could live with. As the author, I could grant limited use. The contract said so. On the call, I watched the red error counters stop climbing. One by one, modules flickered back to life, tax engines recalculated, sync jobs retried, the flood slowed to a manageable leak. Ty sat very still the whole time. Once he tried to interject to ask if we could get ahead of the optics by framing this as a planned modernization hiccup. I looked at him over the top of my screen and told him the only optics that mattered right now were auditors and judges. He shut up. We worked 18 billed hours over 3 days. I slept in shifts, but it was different this time. Every time my phone buzzed, I saw the meter running. 10,000 an hour to mop up decisions made in rooms I hadn't been invited into. It didn't make up for the years I'd done it for free on salary paid in coffee and overtime pizza, but it tasted better, like real coffee instead of burnt mud. When the immediate crisis was contained, the second wave hit. Marlowe's legal sent Brightline a notice of breach, citing the clause I'd pointed to. They wanted concessions, fee reductions, extended support, a commitment in writing that no key technical staff would be removed without advance discussion. Other big customers heard about the meltdown and started digging out their contracts too. Brightline's stock, never exactly a rocket ship, slid hard. It wasn't public, but word of mouth in the private equity and vendor spaces is a blood sport. Within a month, the company's valuation in back-channel talks had dropped by nearly 40%. Cash that had been earmarked for Ty's community platform went to lawyers and credits. Harold did the thing old men with money hate most, he apologized privately. He told me he'd thought I was being overly cautious about the licenses. He said he hadn't realized the old language still had teeth. I told him that was the problem. Nobody ever reads the teeth until they're bleeding. Ty didn't last much longer. The board tired of explaining to investors why the owner's kid had been anywhere near Core Systems' decisions. A memo went out 3 months after the outage. We thank Tyler Hales for his contributions as Director of Brand and Innovation and wish him the best in his future endeavors. Last I checked, he pivoted back to content. Less power cables there, more ring lights. I stayed on as a ghost in their machine. Not an employee, not obsolete. An external consultant with a retainer, a calendar I controlled, and the ability to say no without HR scripts. They called when something rattled in the walls. I'd log in, smell the phantom ozone, taste remembered battery acid coffee, and invoice them for every minute I spent holding together a machine that still carried my fingerprints in its code. When the new CIO, an older woman from a real enterprise background, suits instead of hoodies, came in, she asked me why I hadn't just burned it all down when they fired me. I told her the truth. The company was a machine. Machines don't deserve revenge, people do. The best revenge wasn't the outage or the stock drop or watching an influencer son face actual consequences. It was having them pay 5 figures an hour to listen to the same woman they once called obsolete, explaining slowly one more time how their own contracts and code work. The office still smells like dust and despair when I visit. The coffee is still sludge, the fluorescents still buzz, systems still hum until they don't. The difference now is the line item on their balance sheet. It doesn't say legacy overhead anymore. It says external consultant root license and core systems advisory. They used to pay me in quarterly reviews and cold pizza. Now they wire $200,000 before I touch a keyboard. Optics, I guess.